What we're going to do is we're going to talk about other.
No, I heard you, Bob.
We're going to talk about other legislation that was passed during the Great Society. In other words, pieces of legislation passed that Lyndon Johnson was responsible for during his own administration. And we talked about one already, and that was the Highway Beautification Act. The Highway Beautification Act. Now, this was something, as I mentioned yesterday, that really was initiated by Lady Bird Johnson, and it called for the beautification of highways. As you know it today, we have these still working today where there is a stretch of interstate or a stretch of two-lane highway that people claim and they clean up. It's still going today. It was very important to Lady Bird Johnson, and to me it's a little bit amazing the Highway Beautification Act is still intact today, which it is. You may be familiar with this next act that was passed during the Great Society. It was called the Housing and Urban Development Act. The Housing and Urban Development Act, which stands for what? What's the short for that? We have these types of housing right here in Worland.
Low income?
Low income. HUD. You ever heard of HUD housing? HUD homes, H-U-D. So he developed the Housing and Urban Development Act. And what that did, and we have samples of it right here in Worland, is this law called for the construction at the time of 250,000 low-rent, low-income housing units. So the Housing and Urban Development Act was passed during the Great Society, and it called for the construction of 250,000 low-rent, low-income housing units. And that's expanded tremendously, not only to low-rent units, but also, what does HUD also give now? What else can you get through HUD applications, housing and urban development? Low-interest what? Loans to buy homes, okay? So I'll give you a couple examples. On these rental units, and it happens still today, what do they base your rent on? Your income. So you have to apply, and you have to have a certain income. In other words, it has to be below this mark. And once you qualify for HUD low-income rental units, then they find out how much money you make, and they determine your rent based on your income. And it's to help people that are not doing well financially to have a place to live. They expanded that in later years to have HUD loans where you could apply for a loan, a low-interest loan, because of your financial situation, and you could purchase a home. And they even had some of those types of loans that even though Maddie didn't apply for that loan and get that loan originally, the person that got the loan and bought the house now wants to sell their house, and Maddie could inherit that low income or low interest loan, and it would make it easier for the seller to sell. So if you could get, buy a HUD home from someone, you could inherit that low interest loan too. So that's what the Housing and Urban Development Act did during the Johnson administration, was allow for, at first, the construction of 250,000 low rent, low income housing units, but it later expanded to even purchasing. The third law that was passed during his administration was the Immigration Act. The Immigration Act. And Donald Trump would not like this very well. He doesn't like it now. Now, what happened prior to Lyndon Johnson passing this through Congress, there was a quota system for immigrants into the United States. What's a quota system mean? A limit, okay? Quotas. There could only be 10,000 a year come in from foreign countries and only 5,000 from this country. A quota system is a system that limits the number of people that can do things. Well, prior to this, there was a quota system. The Immigration Act that was passed during the Johnson administration abolished that quota system, and it allowed more and more immigrants to come into this country. And again, it would not be something that Donald Trump would be totally in favor of. So the Immigration Act simply abolished the quota system that only allowed a certain number of people to come in. Now, the last two we talked about, you can tell what Johnson's trying to do. He's trying to give opportunities for everyone that only a few afforded prior. He's really working for the common and low-income person. That's what he did. Okay, any questions on those three laws? Okay, we're going to talk about the American space program turns to Gemini. And I'll give you a little rehearse on this. The first space program was what? Mercury. There are the Mercury 7 astronauts on the wall, excluding Gus Grissom. And that space program that gave us our first, wins in the race for space is going to metamorphosize into Gemini, which is going to metamorphosize into Apollo, and it will be the Apollo missions that get us onto the moon. Okay? Remember, President Kennedy made the comment that before the end of the decade, we would land a man safely on the moon and return him home. Well, that started really with Gemini. Okay? It was the second American space program, and I could lecture for 2 weeks on Gemini and tell you all about it. We'll just kind of give you a little sampling of it. And again, like I mentioned, Project Gemini was the single purpose of Project Gemini was to prepare the United States for a moon landing. That was the whole purpose of the space program. They knew that Gemini wouldn't be the program landing on the moon. They knew that Gemini would be the program that allowed the next program of Apollo to land on the moon. Now, when you think about what they could do in the past with the Mercury space program, the Gemini missions are going to provide two specific things to try to prepare for this upcoming moon landing. Okay? The Gemini program is going to try to prepare for two specific things that would allow for a successful moon mission. Now, I want you to think about that a little bit. What would they have to do differently than they did in Mercury to get a man on the moon? Well, and think about what you're saying there, because you're making the point, but what are the Mercury space flights been like? Short, right? What's the longest we ever had anybody in space? A couple days, right? So one of the criteria of Gemini is to find a way that man can sustain himself in space for a longer period of time, because it's going to take time to get to the moon and back. So the first specific thing that needed to be thought about in preparation for an upcoming moon landing was to develop the ability to support astronauts in space for a length of time sufficient for a moon mission. You got to be up there more than 3 orbits. You got to be up there for days, and you got to figure out how that's going to work. Now, what else is going to have to be done for a successful moon mission? And you might not know this unless you've done a little research, but I'm thinking Sherman should know. You're kind of a lunar lady, aren't you? You like the space program. Yeah, so when they land on the moon and come back, what are they going to have to be able to do to make that work? Okay, but they are, but so, and this is hard, you wouldn't understand it, but the capsule that's going to take them to the moon isn't going to be what lands on the moon. And we'll talk about that later. So you've got to be able to take another craft out of the craft and put it together and dock it so the astronauts can get from one part of the capsule to the other, so the lunar lander, which we'll talk about later, can get on the moon while the rocket that took you into the moon's circled. So when man landed on the moon, it had 3 astronauts. Only 2 got on the moon. The other one was the pilot, and he circled the moon, waiting for them to come back up so he could take them home. Okay? So you have to be able to dock. You have to be able to get 2 vehicles to dock and be able to exchange personnel between the 2. And that's what the Gemini mission was set up to do, was to develop astronauts the opportunity to stay in space for a length of time sufficient for a moon landing, and to develop a rendezvous and docking technique that would be required if they were ever going to land on the moon. We're getting ahead of ourselves, but this spacecraft turns out to be a long cylindrical spacecraft, and part of it comes off as they go into space, and all you've got left is the rocket that took you into space, the command module, and the lunar module, which is going to land on the moon. It looks like an insect that comes down. We'll talk about that. Those things all have to be able to work together, and that's what Gemini did. Now, the most famous probably Gemini trip was Gemini 7. And it would be in space for the longest time in space history. These astronauts that are on Gemini 7 are going to be in space for 2 weeks. They're going to be up in space for 2 weeks. And it was actually the 4th manned Gemini flight, but it was probably the most famous. Gemini 7. It was going to have 2 astronauts in space for 14 days, 2 weeks. And although it was the 4th Gemini flight, it is the most famous. The 2 astronauts in that particular flight were the command pilot Frank F. Borman II. Frank F. Borman II. And maybe a more familiar name, if you watch the movie Apollo 13, would be pilot James A. Lovell Jr. So the 2 astronauts that flew in Gemini 7 were command pilot Frank F. Borman II and James A. Lovell Jr. Here is a picture of Frank Borman right up here, kiddos. You can see him in his space suit there, and then this is a picture of he and I together. He owns a ranch in Hysham, Montana, and he buys cars from my good friend Brent Heverly at Heverly Ford. And that's a picture of him when he was an astronaut, and that's in later life. That Bronco that I bought last year, if you saw, was Frank Borman's. He originally bought that, and when my friend Brent Heverly saw him trade it in, he said, "I've got a vehicle for you." And so it now is in my garage. I was thinking about taking it apart and putting it together in here, but I didn't think that would work. Anyway, I'm very proud. You know what's on my license plate? Apollo 8, which we'll get to later. Okay. But Gemini 7, okay? All right, now, Gemini 7 launched from the Kennedy Space Center on December 4th, 1965. It launched from Kennedy Space Center on December 4th, 1965, and it landed back on December 18th, 1965. So Gemini 7 launched from the Kennedy Space Center on December 4th, 1965, and it landed safely back on Earth December 18th, 1965. Now, I lied a little bit. They didn't spend 14 days in space. They spent 13 days, 18 hours, 35 minutes, and 1 second in space. But it still was the longest any 2 astronauts had spent in space in American history. So it took off on December 4th, 1965, landed safely back on Earth on December 8th, 1965, spent nearly 14 days, you don't have to write that down, 13 days, 18 hours, 35 minutes, and 1 second in space. And guess how many orbits they made of the Earth? 206 orbits around the Earth. That's a lot. 206. That actually was 487,000 nautical miles. They made 206 orbits around the Earth. Now, if they're going to try to be able to rendezvous and dock, aren't they going to have some help to do that on this mission? That's where Gemini 6A came into place. So while Gemini 7 was up there almost 14 days doing 206 orbits, Gemini 6A came up, and Gemini 6A docked and rendezvoused with Gemini 7 to show that they could do that successfully, and then Gemini 6A returned to Earth. So Gemini 7 would be joined in orbit by Gemini 6A, and they would perform the first rendezvous maneuver of a manned spacecraft, and then Gemini 6A came back down to Earth, and Gemini 7 continued to try to prove how long astronauts could stay in space. There were 16 astronauts that took part in the Gemini space program, 16. And 15 of those 16 would take part in the upcoming Apollo missions, which would successfully land a man on the moon and return him safely. That would be Apollo 11. And that's another story for another time period we'll talk about. And Frank Borman's going to come back into space in probably the most famous space flight prior to Apollo 11, and that's going to be Apollo 8. Because what he does there is he sets the stage for Apollo 11 by being the first astronaut to go around the moon and come back to Earth. Okay, we'll talk about that later. Okay, so there's your Gemini program and what its importance was set up. So now we're going to move to 1966 at a glance and tell you all kinds of fun things that happened in each month of 1966. I kind of like these. I'm hoping the first one will jog your memory a little bit later, but I don't know about what you guys do on the weekends as far as watching different movies, if this would ring a bell. Let's talk about January 17th of 1966. And what happened on January 17th of 1966 is an American B-52 bomber, which is an airplane, collided with its fuel resupply plane in midair. I don't know if you've ever watched on TV where you try to fuel a plane in air. Well, there was an American B-52 bomber that during the time they were trying to resupply that plane with fuel, the plane collided with the refueling plane in midair. And they were off the coast of Spain when they did so. They were off the coast of Spain when they did so. So an American B-52 bomber collides with its fuel resupply plane in midair, and 8 of the 14 crew members on both sides, so to speak, were killed. 8 of the 14 crew members of those 2 planes were killed. 6 survived. Now that wasn't the worst disaster or potential disaster, because despite the fact, with sadly 8 of the 14 crew members were killed, a hydrogen bomb known as an H-bomb was dislodged from the bomber and it fell into the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Spain. Not good, right? A hydrogen bomb is like an atomic bomb, full of radiation, etc. And when those 2 planes collided, an H-bomb or hydrogen bomb that was on board the B-52 dislodged and ended up into the Atlantic Ocean. So what do you think had to happen then? They had to find it to see if there was any leaks or whatever. So the Pentagon dispatched planes and 1,000 sailors and soldiers to look for the bomb to no avail, which means they didn't find it yet. Okay, so that's what happened on January 17th of 1966. The Pentagon is dispatching planes and 1,000 sailors and soldiers to look for this hydrogen bomb that fell into the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Spain to no avail. Now we'll see. I know this class, every class is different. This class maybe is a little bit less sportsy than classes I've had before, which is great. So we'll see we'll see how this goes. On February 15th of 1966, you ever heard of Wilt Chamberlain? Anybody heard of Wilt Chamberlain? How many people in here have heard of Wilt Chamberlain? Okay, what was the significance of Wilt Chamberlain, really? Yeah, but why? He was really tall. He was like 7'2". He's one of the tallest NBA players at the time. Well, on the 15th of February, 1966, Wilt Chamberlain, where is my picture of Wilt? Right here. This fellow broke the NBA scoring record for a career. In other words, he scored more points than anyone else in the history of the NBA on that date. When he made baskets that particular day, he broke the record. Now, the record belonged to this fellow right here, Bob Pettit. Bob Pettit was the scoring leader whose record was broke by Wilt Chamberlain on February 15th of 1966. Now, you don't have to write all these statistics down. I just want to make a point so you can kind of see the achievement. Bob Pettit's record was 20,880 points. That's how many he had scored up to that point. And obviously, Wilt Chamberlain scored one more than that to break the record, right? Well, it took Pettit 11 seasons to score that many points. It only took Chamberlain 7 seasons to score that many points, okay? And Chamberlain's probably most remembered for the fact that he scored 100 points in one NBA basketball game, which is still an NBA record, okay? So, Wilt Chamberlain. Now, here's my question, and we'll have a little fun with this maybe. As of yesterday, anybody knew who the leading scorer in NBA history is? Not Wilt Chamberlain, obviously, not Bob Pettit. Anybody have a guess, basketball? Good guess and correct. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is the leading scorer in NBA history. He has 38,387 points. So let's let you know how things have changed. Anybody know anything about him? Great big 7'2", played for the LA Lakers and Milwaukee Bucks. Had the old skyhook, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. You guys, whatever. We'll get to this. I'm going to see if we can figure out, and I know it's not for everybody, but let's see if we can figure out the top 10, just for the fun of it. So Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is 1. I will tell you that Wilt Chamberlain is 5. He's now 5, okay? He ended up scoring, Wilt Chamberlain, 31,419 points. Now anybody and I've got 2, I'll give you this hint, I've got 2 that are still playing in the top 10. 2 that are still active. What? Dirk Nowitzki? Yeah, very good. He is 6th for a wrestler. I'm pretty impressed here. And LeBron James is 7th. Okay? Anybody know of any players that might be in the top 10? What? Kobe Bryant is 3rd. Michael Jordan is 4th. Shaquille O'Neal is 8th. This is really, I'm impressed. So we need 2, 9, and 10. No, that's amazing. Larry Bird's not in the top 25. Doesn't that kind of amaze you? He is not in the top 25. Magic Johnson is not in the top 25.
Who was 25 or top 10?
What? We're doing top 10, but you're throwing names out. Like, I'm amazed that Bird's not even in the top 25. But we're doing the top 10. We need 2, 9, and 10. I'd be really impressed if you get these. You should know.
Charles Barkley?
Charles Barkley used to be in the top 25, but got knocked out recently. Anybody? The Mailman. Oh, come on! Really?
Number 2?
The Mailman's number 2. He played a lot with John Stockton. Karl Malone. Very good. Hey, NBA history here.
Oh,
Do you know who the top 10 scorers are in NBA history?
Jabbar is one.
There you go. Look at Mrs. Pike go. You go, girl.
Chamberlain.